All right, at this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Chris Murphy is the CEO of Zoomforth, the recruitment marketing software for the visual era. Zoomforth helps talent acquisition professionals at companies like Deloitte, AT&T, and Eventbrite quickly gather photos and videos and build beautiful on-brand web pages that immediately show what makes them different. So with that said, here's Chris.
Thank you, and I am super excited to be chatting with you all today. As Katrina mentioned, I'm going to be going through some slides here and sort of laying out how we as recruiters or recruiting managers can stand out to tech talent. And there's a lot of material I have to share, but as mentioned, ask questions, and I'll sort of change the cadence of the presentation based on questions if there's a lot of interest in a particular thing that I'm talking about. So be liberal with your thoughts and questions through GoToWebinar, and we'll move from there. So the thing I'll start with is the reason that I am speaking to you in particular about how to stand out when recruiting the tech talent. So this is a quick introduction to me and who we are. So there are three reasons that I am speaking with you. One, Zoomforth is a software company. So our core talent is technical. This consumes a great deal of our time in recruiting. Two, we're based in San Francisco, which is arguably the most competitive place on earth to recruit technical talent. And three, our core product helps companies better market themselves to talent. We help startups whose core products are indeed software, like Eventbrite and Asana, do that. We also help Fortune 100 finance, energy, and services companies who aren't software programs but still need to recruit tech talent. So just quickly, I want to go over what we're going to cover today. The first thing is going to be how to build a story that tech talent will pay attention to. So what that story is and how to frame it. Second thing we're going to dive into is tips for email and inmail. Obviously, those are but two channels of very, very many channels we should be recruiting on, but we're going to focus on those for that second part. And then the final thing I'm just going to briefly touch on is quick mistakes to avoid. So those things that should be red flags if you catch yourself doing them. The reason that we have so many attendees today is that getting the attention of tech talent is among the most significant challenges in recruiting, right? So today, every company, as is often said, is a tech company, or at least heavily relies on technology. So we need technologists, and it's a candidates market. So that being the dynamic, your goal is to cut through the noise, to stand out, to make somebody see you. And that means that fundamentally, you are a storyteller. If you are in recruiting, you're a storyteller. If you're doing volume recruiting and you need to put butts in seats, maybe that's a little bit different, or maybe you have different techniques for storytelling. I'd still argue you're a storyteller, but we're talking today about tech talent. And this is the most competitive demographic to recruit for, so you need to make sure you're standing out. On this particular webinar, we have growing startups whose central product is not tech. We have small startups whose central product is. We have big staffing firms, little staffing firms. We have universities. We have mid-market staple companies. We have household name Fortune 500s. We have Fortune 100s without consumer brands. And so there's a pretty diverse range of audiences here. And what I'm going to do is give you some tips and tools and systems that you can use for your recruiting efforts that will apply no matter where you fit into that list I just enumerated. But the reality is, for the most part, every one of you on this will be recruiting technical talent in a different way. So a developer is not going to take a job at GE for the same reason that an account executive will. If you have 10 offices around the world, the culture in each office might be different, right? So you have different reasons that folks are going to be joining different companies. And you need to really focus on the thing that makes you different. So you might have a single candidate who'd accept a job both at GE or at a Lyft, but they're going to be accepting that for a different reason. So you need to build a story that speaks to those reasons at your company. So what I'm going to start with here is how we're going to tell a story the right way and why it matters. So step one here is helping you all understand the components of a good recruiting story. So I'm going to go through 5 quick components that any good recruiting story, when you're standing out to tech talent or anybody else, 5 components that you should know and that make it easy to sort of categorize and tell your story. So the first component of a story of why you should come and work with us, if I'm reaching out to a candidate on email, if I'm talking to somebody in person, if I'm at an event, something I should know is what we would call the opportunity is. So what I want is that any candidate, when they see what I have to offer, says, cool. Now that could be, and that's sort of at the minimum. That could be for different reasons, right? Maybe people are wowed because it's the impact your product has on a large number of people. Maybe it's the scale of what you're doing. Perhaps you're in a very small niche that appeals to this particular candidate. Whatever it is, what is your wow factor, right? What makes people excited about the business? The second thing is people. This is fairly self-explanatory and, in my opinion, the easiest to overlook. It's the default way to distinguish yourself. Who are you? Who is on the team with which others will be working? Who's your leadership? Who are the folks that you are recruiting somebody to be around for most of their waking hours, right? 3 is values. So why do you show up to work? What orients your relationships? Are there particular values that really stand out at your company? 4 is cultural or social. So really, are you a fun place to work? Or maybe not. Maybe you focus on, maybe your cultural story is more around focus or how you work. But what distinguishes you there? The next is learning and development. So whether you are a startup or a big company, assuredly you have a story to tell about what someone might learn when they join your company, but that story might be dramatically different. If you're working in a small company, learning and development might focus on autonomy. If you're a large company, your learning and development narrative might focus on structure and the resources that you put into place to help people grow. So these are the components of your story. So now you sort of have the quick ones. Sort of what's that wow factor of the business opportunity? Who are the people? What are the values? What's your culture? And what are the learning and development opportunities? And perhaps you've defined that for your company. Maybe you've worked with an agency to develop your EVP, or maybe you just figured this out internally, and you've come to refine your company-wide employer brand. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe you're thinking, well, shoot, we don't really have a strong high-level story for our company. No matter, because we're not talking about telling a broad story, right? Your story has to be relevant. And this is one of the biggest mistakes we see in recruitment storytelling and in our efforts to really stand out to candidates. We need to segment. We need to take a page out of sales and marketing books and recognize that when we're speaking to candidates, we can't be speaking with the same story to every candidate. We have to be telling a story that resonates with them, and this is no more true anywhere than with tech talent. So to sort of frame this, something that I think is often worth asking just as an internal audit is, will a developer join your company for the exact same reason that an account executive would? Absolutely not. If you have 15 different offices, will the culture in each office be the same? Almost assuredly not. Some of your elements of your top level story of this broad employer value proposition, if you've defined it, might apply universally. You might have the same leadership that's going to inspire people to show up. You might have some of the same values. Perhaps that wow factor will remain. But a lot of the reasons that someone joins your company will be really specific to the role they're in, the specific team they're working with, or where they're working. So you need to tell that story. And because we're in this webinar to talk about recruiting tech talent, and that's a different story than recruiting sales talent or professional services or admins, we're going to sort of re-audit some of those components of a recruiting story. And I also want to sort of briefly talk about, when we audit those, some of the things that might be more relevant to tech talent. Again, what I want to mention is that every group on this call needs to figure out your own story. And I'm going to walk you through a bit later how to audit your own story. But what's very important is that you are not telling a story I prescribed for you or that your neighbor is prescribing for you, but you are figuring out these components as they apply to your own company. And as recruiters, we're describing them effectively. So again, what is the opportunity for tech talent we're recruiting? Are we recruiting developers to build product, QA, dev support? If product, what are we actually building? Is it new frameworks I'm working with? Will I be carving new ground on any of this stuff, or am I actually in a support role? And if the latter, what's the impact of that? Maybe if I'm working in a large company, I'm supporting a large global staff that is then servicing a much larger global audience. What's the business opportunity there? Why is what I'm doing wow worthy, right? 2 is people. Are there folks on my team from whom I can learn? This is a thing that I think is universally interesting, right? Like learning, but I think perhaps especially true of many developers. I think there is a culture of mastery among engineers that as recruiters we need to respect and message to. So how do you surround people with others who are going to help developers and engineers manifest mastery, right? 3 is values. So some of these top-level values, like I mentioned before, might apply uniformly, right? So if we say that one of our values is we appreciate diversity, we want that also to apply to recruiting tech talent. But there are also some values that might be on a development team, on a tech team, or with any given developer that might be uniquely applicable to developers. So, for example, are you contributing to open source frameworks in any respect? We, for example, at Zoomforth, one of our values that's company-wide but that is specific to developers is to follow the Zen of Python. Now, that might mean nothing to folks who aren't developers, but if you work in Python, which is a language, there are a set of rules about how you build something that are deeply important to most developers we work with on our team and others that we'll talk to. So one of the values things that I think is particularly important to tech talent is how you work. This might be no truer for any other role than for developers, especially because something that I think is worth keeping in mind is that developer time, and this is why we pay such a premium for developers and why they're very hard to find, developer time is really valuable. And something I often like to say is that if you have 1 hour at 100% efficiency from a developer, it's probably more valuable than 5 hours at 60% efficiency, because so much of good development is framing problems. So you want to create environments in which those problems can best be solved. So the systems, how we work, can be values oriented and a really important message on it. Next is the cultural and social. So your engineering team might be different culturally from other teams. What are the things that unify it, and what are the things that don't? How can you message to each? And then the last one, learning and development. I think in different areas, engineers are going to have different opportunities to learn. Generally, again, like I said, I think most good tech talent really wants to learn, though that might come from 2 different avenues. I mean, it might come from many, but 2 specific ones might be autonomy versus being surrounded by a particularly experienced team, right? So are you bringing somebody in to build and chart a new course and figure it out? That's exciting to a lot of people. To other folks, what might be exciting is being surrounded by mentors who can guide them. So what is it for you? The last thing that I'm going to quickly speak to on sort of components of a recruiting story as it relates to tech talent is comp. This is not the thing that generally I think is going to help you win the war for talent, because for the most part, you're going to be competing with other companies who can offer the exact same. You should, however, know the game that you're in, right? So developers, I think, being highly coveted, know their own value. So you should be able to at least speak to that. And if you're offering less than that, understand why they would sacrifice on comp to come to you. This is a very common thing. Oftentimes, early stage companies are providing learning opportunities and equity. Later stage, you might be providing more benefits comp. Sometimes comp might be the story in and of itself, like you're just offering an insane amount of money. But I think what's most important when you come to comp is just knowing the game that you're in. But generally, that is not the thing that I think you want to lead with. And I'm going to speak a bit more to why you don't want to lead with that later, and it's largely because you want to be differentiated. And generally, this is not something that's going to differentiate you. So the next question is, okay, how do I uncover these components? So like, great, you just laid out a framework, 5 different components I can message to. We haven't defined these as a company. What do I do? Maybe you don't have the time to do a full survey, go with tools that can help you do that, the budget to work with, consultative services and evaluate X, Y, and Z of these. At minimum, here's a really, really easy tip to uncover some of those components. Ask the hiring manager or any employee on your team who's in that role, or any friend who might be relevant for that role. I think this is like the simplest thing that people often ignore, because it just seems that we're running through the motions and we should know what email to craft and send it. Do a sniff test with developers. People can see through this stuff really easily. So take some of these components and just ask people to speak to them. That is sort of the minimum to get some of those components, if you don't already have them. With that said, I'm going to run you through a very quick, what I call recruitment storytelling checklist. So we know the components of a story, right? We have, what's that wow factor, the business opportunity, who are the people, what are the values, what's the culture, and what learning and development opportunities do we have? You can split that in a lot of different ways, right? You don't need to tell every one of those components. There's a lot of meat in there. But when you're telling that story, once you have that those components, these are sort of the following things, however you aggregate that need to be in place for any story to be effective. So the first one on this is that your story has to be visible. People need to see it. This is maybe so obvious as to be trite, but it's sort of the if a tree falls in the woods, right? Whether this is showing up in person, telling your story, whether it's making sure you're on the right channels, you are physically where your candidates are, stories have to be visible. One of the ways that I think you can make your story invisible is by including too much. So what we often see in recruiting is really long emails, exhaustively long. We are trying to capture the attention of candidates who are getting flooded with solicitations, and we try to sell them everything. This is the easiest type of email to ignore, because the thought of looking at all of that is just overwhelming to me. And I know that if I am a valued candidate, somebody should be able to, and I'm looking at a valuable opportunity, somebody should be able to synthesize what they do, right? So this doesn't stand out to me. This just gets lost in the noise. So this could be anything from writing a great headline, right? Like, how do you capture attention quickly? Upgrading your visuals, right? Stock photography of overly pretty people in suits generally sends a bad signal to candidates. Get the team to share your story. Just how do you get your story in front of candidates, right? What's visible? The next is differentiated. So this is among the most important of this checklist. So in all of our efforts to stick out to candidates, generally I think we tend to want to prioritize our best components, right? So we tend to prioritize things we feel most strongly about in our own company or our own role. So for example, if we have an amazing business opportunity, often we'll lead with that. If our leadership is fantastic, we might lead with that. It's the wrong move to prioritize what's best about us. This seems sort of counterintuitive, but we're talking here about standing out. So first things first in your story, you should prioritize what makes you different. So what we do when we work with customers, we go through any sort of audit of a recruitment marketing story, we go through those components. We say, okay, what's the opportunity here? What's the team? What can somebody learn? What's going to get them excited? What are the values that resonate? Which of those is strongest for us? What do we really focus on? You might not have all of those. You almost assuredly don't have a strong story across every single one of those, even if you're developing. But then we say, okay, which of these do our competitors also have in a way that's also very strong? And we look at that, and then we prioritize the ones that make us different. And that's something you should do in your messaging, in your sort of internal audits. How are you actually different from others? Because that's the thing that not only is going to make you stand out, but it's going to be the thing that makes you stand out to the candidates that fit well with you. So think about differentiation. The thing that we often see, for example, here in the Valley is we have big company benefits with a startup culture. Candidates hear that all the time. Make sure you are not, it's very seductive to follow the messaging of other strong employment brands, but it only will get you lost in the crowd. So make sure not to fall into those, what may seem like catchy messages. Figure out what makes you different if indeed you need to stand out to tech talent. Next is be specific. So in your messaging to candidates and your stories, are you using buzzwords, or if you're putting yourself in the candidate's shoes, does it actually make sense that you're speaking to them, right? So is it more compelling to hear a company say, we give our engineers lots of responsibility from day one, or to hear an engineer themselves say, I pushed code my first week at the company, even though I was coming straight out of college, and hear the implications that it had. Think about specificity in your storytelling. And then the last one I'm going to speak to is credibility. And I think this is the easiest one when we're talking to a spectrum of companies, all of whom need to attract tech talent that maybe gets pushed by the wayside. So when you're doing your checklist, especially when we're talking to tech talent, realize that candidates and the highly competitive ones are very sensitive to being sold to. So they see all of the opportunities coming their way. It's very easy to tell when a recruiter is pushing something that's inauthentic. So the question that we want to ask is like, who are we as a company? It's not what's my competitor messaging on, or what are the sort of like messaging trends in recruiting. It is who are we and how can we credibly tell that story? So are we really a product-focused company, right? Is that our focus? Is it to build product that engineers can come in and sprint with? If not, let's not message about that. Let's find a developer who wants to, if we're looking for dev support for a large organization that isn't a technical company, we need to find a developer who fits in that role. And attempts to find developers who want to build product will not work. So we really need to audit ourselves and make sure we are speaking to folks who will fit the roles for which we're hiring. We don't need to be a company that's being lampooned in Silicon Valley and has all the sexy startup stuff, right? Many extraordinary developers bristle at that culture, live in middle America, and are risk averse and don't want the volatility of a startup. On the flip side, many do, right? So figure out who we are. Another thing with credibility, and I think folks struggle with on the recruiting end, is as a recruiter or recruitment manager, do you have the language to communicate your story? So are you familiar with the frameworks in which the candidate will be working? Do you have a high-level understanding of some of the most interesting challenges the candidate might be undertaking? If not, bone up, work with your hiring manager, figure out exactly, you do not need to be a developer, but figure out how to speak a base level language that makes you credible. And then if you're making bold statements, right, whether that's about the specifics of what someone would be doing in a tech job or just who you are as a company or your values, make sure you're backing it up, right? So if you say that like people love working there, but you have a 1 on Glassdoor, that could be problematic. So make sure you have the verifications in place to back up your story. Having testimonials, having people, authentic content of speaking to the things that you're advertising is really important. And the last thing I'll just sort of return to is that again, you want to ask your team about this. Involve your team in the messaging. And oftentimes at big companies this is hard, right? Because a lot of the storytelling comes top down. But it's pretty easy to do sniff tests with your colleagues around stuff like this. Push your email by someone who's working in this role and say, would this stick with you? Would this resonate? So next, I'm just going to quickly run through where visuals can help you, and then we're going to go some email campaigns, and then look at fails to avoid. So quickly, one thing we want to sort of speak to is why to use visual media and how in storytelling, whether that's email, in-mail, directing people, why this matters. So very quickly, one thing I'll show you is graphs, the lines of which should tell us why this matters. Basically, all of our candidates are already communicating with visual media, right? In the consumer space, this is ubiquitous, only going up and to the right dramatically quickly. This is sort of the language of today, right? So we see, whether it's on social channels or otherwise, folks want to consume visual content. But it's tough for us in talent acquisition to be able to really message with that because we're often using channels that are harder to leverage visual media, right? Email, in-mail can be tough. But we can do this, and I want to sort of illustrate both how and when to use visual media and when not to, right? So how and when to use visual media. One of the 3 categories I'm going to lay out for when you should think about using visuals is people, places, and experiences. So these are all things where visuals can move the needle better than text and just better describe something, right? So this is a standard job posting. This is with visuals. All of a sudden, we know more about someone. In the same way that at the beginning of this slide presentation, I showed you a few photos of myself and you know more about me. This is how we can stand out to candidates, right? We want to introduce people to cultures, to environments, and to people. We want to build trust. This is where photos and videos really can move the needle. The second thing is credibility. So this was like a couple months ago. Some of you might have seen this. If we just have text here, we say, hey, our CEO said we have a workplace culture of transparency at Facebook. You might think, oh, you know, Zuckerberg is credible, or you might absolutely not, right? Either way, you're sort of taking impressions that are already implanted and doing with those what you will if you're a candidate. However, where Mark Zuckerberg actually said this was in a Periscope recording as he was walking through the office. So you got to see this famous CEO who is not the most gifted speaker. He is not the, you know, he's never been famous for rousing emotive speeches, and yet in this video, he seemed totally authentic, and I believed him. And you watch and you say, yeah, you do have a workplace culture of transparency, as he is literally walking you through a transparent office. So this is an example of how you can make a big impression with video. And the last reason, like when to use visual media, is simply standing out, right? People see it. So toss a GIF in your email. Get things that jump out at people. Take up space with visuals if they say something that stand out. I'll quickly add a couple notes of when not to use visual media. Do not use it if it doesn't say anything, right? I think oftentimes we get into dynamics where we know that visuals matter, we want to start using it, and so we just start throwing together stock photos of something, or we just add it in. If your visuals don't say anything, do not use them. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk briefly about email and inmail. As I mentioned, these are two channels, and a similar, I'll sort of conflate them into one to get in front of tech talent. And among the most challenging, and we're big advocates of other channels as well. So like, how do you get your employees to share the stories I've just talked about building, right? How do you build referrals? Where physically are your candidates? Can you bring them to you for events? Can you show up at hackathons? How do you literally get in front of candidates? What events will attract the best fits? How can you build strong relationships with candidates before you ever post a rec? Right, so there are all sorts of other channels, but assuredly email and inmail are critically important ones. So I want to go over a few tips for this channel. So one is tell a story quickly, right? So all of the lessons that I've sort of gone over in storytelling need to apply to your inmail and email. They need to be succinct. If you have too much, you blend in. If you don't lead with differentiated material, you'll get lost in the noise. You need to write good headlines. How do you create literally a thing that a snapshot of which is going to stand out? Two, use links and images. Basically, every study of email, as well as candidate job postings, will affirm that using links and images will increase your response rates. And I'm happy to follow up with specific numbers on us. If you're interested, feel free to reach out. But the email I showed you at the beginning, where you have 4 paragraphs worth of text, a much better way to generate that email would have been to have 1 paragraph with a link to the other detail, however you're introducing that other detail. Because then you're basically inviting somebody to only see the things that are most important and then dive into additional context if they're interested. So use links and images. Some of the most outstanding recruiting emails I've ever seen use GIFs because they are moving images that work in emails. But use those to stand out and also get all the information you need without throwing in too much. The next, of course, is personalize. This is a tension that every recruiter we talk to faces. There's what I would call a personalization curve, where basically you are balancing the value of any individual candidate versus the time it takes to personalize. So for example, if we're chasing a candidate for a position and they are insanely valuable to us, this single candidate, and we know it's one person that will transform our business, it is worth getting your team on a plane and personalizing a dance for them wherever they are. And that also would cost an insane amount of money and a lot of time. You're almost never going to do that. On the flip side, if you anonymize everything, you're not going to stand out to everybody. So you have to make some dynamic calculations and figure out just how much is it worth personalizing to somebody. And oftentimes, and this sort of leads me into my next one, we need to use sales and marketing tools to do this. So this is a game that recruiting, I think, is quickly catching up to. But there are a host of tools to help us, for example, personalize without doing much more work. Use A-Text, for example, which is a quick templating tool. Create drip campaigns that can help us automatically follow up with candidates if they haven't responded to an email. Use Mixmax. There are all sorts of tools, and again, we're happy to share these with you later. Follow sales blogs, not because recruiting is sales. There are many differences, and there are differences in personalities and how we work with people. But sales, most sales blogs will introduce you to the leading tools and techniques to get ahead and make sure that you can both monitor your messages and stand out. And to the last point, test, measure, and refine. Sort of quickly, I think the last thing that we see, the last thing that I'll mention that we see a lot of recruiters really struggle with, and part of this is because I think As recruiters, oftentimes we're not incentivized to take risks, but we get in the habit of sort of just going with the flow, right? Like, I need to hit my numbers, so I'm just going to send this same email out a lot, and I'm going to take the time to do what I need to do to personalize it, but I end up getting pretty cookie cutter, and I don't test, and I don't get outside of this. And I think a mindset that we really, really need to encourage in recruiting, especially when we're talking to tech talent, that there's no way we can effectively stand out and be different if we're doing the same thing. So we need to experiment a bit. And ideally, you can set up split testing, or you can create hypotheses, and then if you have large enough numbers, you can validate those and based on your testing. So test your subject line of your email. Test 500 to one set of candidates, 500 to another. See which resonates more, and then refine and change your messaging. So I would encourage you not to fall into patterns of messaging on inmail or email, because those patterns will get well worn. And so the last thing, and this is the quickest section to cover of everything, this will take me 2 minutes. The last thing I'm going to cover is recruiter fails. So one of the things Recruiting Daily asked me to talk about is recruiter fails. And I think most of you probably know some fairly typical ones, right? Know what you're talking about when you reach out to a candidate, don't use somebody's wrong name, things like that. Those are all obvious. The biggest fail that I see, that if I could offer one takeaway that I hope that you would that you'd leave with and really think about, is that the biggest fail you're going to make is defaulting to the usual, right? So this whole conversation is about how you stand out to a really difficult to attract audience, to people who are getting flooded. The biggest liability that you can create for yourself is doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. Now, this can be tough, especially at larger companies or growing companies, as you're trying to both control messaging and create uniformity and consistency while also allowing for personalization. But if you're in a management role, I would really encourage you to think about how you can set parameters in which recruiters need to sit, and then also within that, give room for personalization. And if you're recruiters, I would think about how to get creative with some of your messaging and testing. Again, if we are trying to stand out, we have to do that by being different and by trying some new things. And I'm happy to give you more ideas of how to be new around that stuff. But I also encourage you to experiment on your own. So with that, I think I am 30 seconds short of time, which basically means I am at time. I'm going to wrap this presentation part up and open it up for questions. And of course, if you're interested in reaching out, you have my contact right there. Awesome. And Katrina, yeah, perfect. You're back on.
I am. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We have a few questions coming in. So let's start with the one that you actually just mentioned. Can you elaborate further on using sales and marketing tools? There were a few examples you mentioned pretty quickly, and I think a few people in our audience would just love to get that list.
Yeah, sure. And this is something I can include in the slides as well, but some free or nearly free tools, because I think those are often the ones that allow recruiters to experiment more quickly. One would be A-Text, lowercase a, capital T-E-X-T. This is just a tool that helps you build templates really quickly so that with short codes you can put text into messaging, wherever that is, whether it's a job posting or email. So A-Text is a great one to save you a lot of time, such that you can take templates and then personalize them. Mixmax is a great one for Gmail. That's M-I-X-M-A-X. That allows you to track who's opening your emails when they're doing that. It allows you to get visuals into your emails pretty quickly. Another one that I mentioned, for which there are many solutions, but something that I strongly encourage teams to think about, is drip campaigns. So one of the most time-consuming things for me when I'm recruiting is not only following up with people, but having to remember who I've followed up with, whether they've responded, monitoring all that. What I think we should be doing much more of in recruiting that is a tried and true sales technique is setting up email campaigns that basically have a cadence, right? So I want to email somebody every 1, 4, 7th, 11th, and 15th day,
Mhm.
right? And if they respond or they get off that campaign, otherwise I keep going. And this sort of brings me quickly to another point. We need to be more persistent, right? So set up that drip campaign and keep pushing. Now, of course, be polite, and if somebody says, hey, I'm not interested, you pull them off that, but allow yourself to automate some of that follow-up.
Awesome. So Brian just posted a question. I want to do a code sprint or hackathon, but I'm not really sure where to start. Do you have any advice for him?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is totally contextual. So I think the general idea is really good, right? You want to, I mean, the general idea is I want to host an event where we're bringing in potential candidates who are technical, hence the hackathon. I mean, you can do non-technical hackathons, but the general idea is I want to bring in technical people to work on a problem because people love working on problems. I think risk of this, and you can invest a lot of resources and not have it really pan out, is that it's not specific to who you are or what you're doing. And so either it's not attractive enough for people to show up, or you might get people showing up who like really aren't relevant to the positions you have. So I think the first thing with any like hackathon or something like that is making sure that either base level is just like a juicy problem to be working on, or sort of like concept for which people might encounter problems, or B, it's relevant to what you do, right? So it's like around a language that you're building in, or a consumer problem that you're facing. There are a host of groups that sort of facilitate hackathons, from whom you can take good examples. But I would say the place to start is figuring out, really like auditing yourself and figuring out what would we, what is not necessarily directly relevant. You don't want to just invite people in to solve your problems, but what's sort of a parallel set of problems that's both interesting and relevant to what we are, and therefore the type of candidates we might want to be interacting with.
Absolutely. And I would say too, of course, I have to give a shout out to our sponsor, HackerRank. They host a lot of hackathons as well. So worth checking out to see, if you can, kind of do it digitally or host one in-house. I think there's a lot of opportunity there as long as you take your advice, which is to really customize it to that problem and solution. I like that.
Yeah, which makes, by the way, like, I mean, that's why I'm a big fan of HackerRank, because I think if, for example, especially if you've, I mean, even if you have done many hackathons, but especially if you haven't, testing the water at a full-blown event can be extremely time-consuming and expensive. So if you're new to this, work with somebody who's good at this, and do some tests with that are a little bit more low barrier.
Absolutely. All right. So if someone's in a really competitive market, where should they look for tech talent?
So I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but I think it depends on where you are geographically, why that market is competitive, and what you're doing, right? So if you are, we're all in a competitive market for tech talent, and I think like a default, for example, is, let's say we're in a startup, it's like, I'm going to move to San Francisco and look for tech talent, or even, a number of the giants in Silicon Valley, like, I'm going to start showing up to SF-based things, or if you're in New York, or if you're in other big cities. One thing worth considering, this creates, it introduces a whole other conversation about systems, but some of the best tech talent, and certainly in the States, are maybe folks with families who are living in not big cities, who are extremely talented but want a 9 to 5, and they're deeply experienced, but they're not in those places. So I think, geographically, I think it is unwise to close yourself off to the regions that are not tech hubs. And then I think, and this is maybe what I would encourage even more, Sure, going to like hackathons, meetups, like hugely important, no doubt about that. And I would say like get your recruiters to those events. If there are expert talks on different frameworks that you might be working with, that you think people would have parallel experience in, like put yourself literally, physically in those scenarios, but also get your employees, if they have friends who are developers or friends of friends, to start building relationships. Like you have to have a long view in a super competitive market, and so you want to start crafting relationships, even if that's like on a like sort of one-to-one basis, soon, now, yesterday, right? You want to be able to, when you actually have a rec open, call on people with whom you already have a relationship, because otherwise you're just really in a tough spot. So I'm a big advocate for however you can do it, or however you can feature your team, to think through the network you have, the network you can build, and start tying together those strings.
Absolutely. And I think actually our next question, I think it touches on that as well. But we're seeing, a lot of tech talent getting off of the social networks because they're tired of the bad recruiters calling them, right? They've gotten 1,000 crazy emails about 1,000 different jobs on LinkedIn, and so they've gotten off of LinkedIn. How could someone, and this is Frank's question, not mine, so how could someone reach those kind of candidates, the ones who are stepping away from social? What are some of your recommendations around that?
Yeah, I mean, just like you just said, Katrina, I think a lot of it does relate to the last answer. Like, I think a lot of that's about building relationships, right?
Mhm.
It's about finding those events. I think sometimes there are some candidates who are deliberately unreachable, right? They don't want to be reached. They know exactly. You don't need to go chase them, right? Certainly, we want to be building relationships with passive candidates. That is like critical, but we don't need to reach every candidate. And so if folks absolutely don't want to be reached out to, that's fine. But I think the way to widen the pool is to think through networks. And I don't mean social networks necessarily. That is one of many channels. But what is your network currently, and how can you strengthen the network that overlaps with development talent? And this is something that like can't be a side thought, right? Even if you're not a tech company, like those are networks you're going to have to start building.
Yeah, and I think that definitely touches on the whole concept of having a talent community. It doesn't have to be digital, right? It doesn't have to
Yep.
be in the hub of a social media page. Like I, I always tell people when you think of a talent community, it's your network of friends, it's not this super defined, super hard to get to thing. Um, and with
Yeah,
that
and
said,
I think
go ahead.
well, I think like the default is to think like, yeah, sure, startups can do that, and then as you get larger, it like becomes
Hmm.
harder to do that. There's no doubt truth to that. But no matter where you are, you're going to have to start building one-to-one relationships if indeed you want to make recruiting just more successful to get tech talent. So, that's just sort of affirming your point. Like,
Yeah.
what is your community, and how can it be more inclusive of the talent that you're going to have to either hire now or soon?
All right, awesome. So with that said, we have reached time. I want to give a special thank you to you, Chris, for presenting all of this awesome content. I feel like everyone on this call really enjoyed it, especially based on all the great questions we got. And a special thank you to our sponsor, HackerRank. If anyone's looking to throw their own hackathons, please check them out. They're absolutely worth your time.